Well, good morning. Glad to have you with us this morning. If you are newer to Crossroads this morning and we haven't met yet, my name is Brian Roberts and I'm the lead pastor here at the church, and we are very grateful to worship alongside each other this morning. As Casey was saying, if this is your first time or you're newer, not only do we have a gift for you out in the lobby, but I'd love to meet you personally and extend my gratefulness to worship alongside. I'll be up here in the front someplace, and just come up and introduce yourself. I'd be glad to spend some time getting to know you a little bit. We're in the middle of a teaching series through Lent, the season leading up to Easter, that we're going through this book by Glandy and Carney. And we're not going chapter by chapter through the book, but we're kind of having this kind of lay the groundwork, the base of our teaching series here. It's called The Way of Grace. So our teaching series is called The Way of Grace, kind of walking through, helping us kind of understand God's grace and God's power at work in our life. If you were here last week, you know that we talked about how God's grace is not just for forgiveness, but it's for all of life. That a good understanding of grace, in particular God's grace, would be God's activity, God's power at work in our life to do for us what we cannot do on our own. That God's grace, in other words, is God's activity at work in your life, even when you don't realize it, to do for you, to move in you, to do for you what you cannot do on your own. And so we're seeking to understand that. How we can live it, how can we understand God's grace, but then how we can extend and be aspects or agents of God's grace to those around us. If you got a worship folder when you came in this morning, in there is a little card. It looks like this. And there's two questions that we're going to wrestle with throughout the rest of the series. Every Sunday, we're going to kind of some way, shape, or form talk about these two questions. On one side of the question is this aspect of where did you see God's grace in your life this week? To take kind of inventory for a minute and just think about, where have I seen God's grace, God's power at work in my life to do for me what I cannot do for myself? Where have I seen and experienced God's grace? We put them on little cards like this so you can put it in your wallet or in your purse or someplace that you can carry with you, to be thinking about these two questions throughout the week during these next few weeks as we lead up to Easter. First question, where have I seen God's grace at work in my life? And then the other side of the card is the second question, is where do I need to see God's grace in this coming week? What aspect am I going to go through? What person am I going to see? What meeting am I going to be at? What phone call am I in? What class am I going to be in? That I need to see God's grace, God's power at work in my life to do for me what I cannot do on my own. Where do I need to see God's grace in my life? And each week as we are in the Lenten series, there will be a time at the end of the service where there will be people on either side of the worship center at the kneeling rails, at the altars there, that will pray for you and with you to see God's grace at more at work in your life. To either celebrate what God is doing and where you see God's grace, or to pray on your behalf that you would experience His grace in the people and the interactions and the experiences that you have during the week. So we give you this little card to have it as a reminder. Put it in your wallet, in your purse, or someplace where you can keep with you. These two questions are going to guide our times together the next few weeks. Where have you seen God's grace, and where do you need to see God's grace? And to kind of lead us in that endeavor, and to kind of start us off with that first question, where have you seen God's grace? I'm going to invite us just to take a minute, a pause for just a second, get yourself comfortable, close your eyes, take a couple deep breaths in. And just replay your week this week. Where did you go? What did you do? What did you experience? Where was God's grace at work in your life this past week? So I'll give you a few seconds or so. Take a couple deep breaths and replay your week and see if you can spot aspects of the divine in your week. Where did you experience God's grace? Let's take a couple deep breaths together, and then we'll dive in to what God may teach us. While this week may, for some of you, been a blur, while it may have kind of bled together and you're not sure where God's grace has been, can I just remind you that the breath that you are taking is God's grace? To waking you up to a new day, to be present with you in this moment is God's grace. I pray during this Lenten series and this season that you would be more aware of God's grace, power at work in your life to do for you what you cannot do on your own, that you would be more aware of that in increasing measure. Increasing measure. Well, we start the second week in our series, A Way of Grace, this morning, where we're seeking really to understand how can we grow in not only understanding and seeing God's grace, but how can we grow in living out that grace? Because grace from God is for all of life. It's not just for forgiveness. It's not just for one-time deal, but it's for all of our life. And I really hope during this series, during these next few weeks, as we lead up to Easter, as we are reflective of God's grace, that we would grow in this. That we would grow in our understanding of what God is doing in and among us and around us all the time. But to kind of zero in, to kind of understand God's grace this morning, the aspect of God's grace I want us to zero in particular this morning is God's grace of compassion. God's grace of compassion. In the book that we're using for this series, Glandy and Carney defines compassion this way, defines it this way. Compassion is the deep awareness of the suffering of another coupled with the wish to relieve it. Compassion is the deep awareness of the sufferings of another coupled with the wish to relieve it. And remember that our definition of grace is the power of God to do for us what we cannot do on our own. That God's grace of compassion is to have a deep awareness of our suffering and a desire to relieve it, to take care of, to walk with us, to relieve us from the suffering, the pain, and the stuff that we're dealing with. And what I want us to see and notice about the grace of compassion is that compassion is true and central to the character of God. That compassion itself is true and central to the character of God Himself. In one of the first, if not the first description that God gives of Himself in the Scriptures, we find it in Exodus chapter 34, verses 5 through 6. And God is describing who He is to Moses, and this is what it says. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed His name, the Lord. And He passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. One of the earliest descriptions that God describes of Himself, the characteristics that God describes of Himself, is this characteristic of compassion. A deep awareness of the sufferings of the people, of God's people, and His desire to relieve it. That central to the character of God is compassion, is the grace of compassion. You see it all throughout the Scriptures. But you don't only see that in God's description of Himself, but you see that in the person of Jesus. The second person of the Trinity, Jesus Himself is full of compassion. You see it in the self-sacrificial love of Christ, not only in His life, but even on the cross. Everything that Christ does is through compassion. It's through compassion. Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, when He, meaning Jesus, when He saw the crowds, He had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus looks out across the fields of these massive multitude of people, and His heart breaks for them. He has deep awareness of their sufferings and a desire to relieve them. He sees them as sheep without a shepherd and a desire to come and to be near them. He has compassion over the multitudes. He sees the masses. But not only does He see the masses, He sees the individual. He sees the person. He sees their individual suffering, their doubts, their insecurities, their history, their baggage that they claim that they carry with them. He sees all of it. And He sees it with compassion. We're told in the Scriptures that He speaks to a Samaritan woman at a well. And He knows her story. He sees her story and He has compassion. We're told that He offers mercy to the woman caught in adultery in front of everybody else that just wants to be punished, and he offers mercy. He has compassion. We're told that he weeps at the grave of his friend Lazarus. Though he knows he's going to be raised from the dead, his heart breaks for the suffering of his friends. He weeps there. And even on the cross, when the criminals are hanging on either side of him, he turns to the one and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." He has compassion. He sees a deep awareness of their suffering and a desire to relieve it. Jesus sees the crowds and the multitudes, but he also sees the individual. And here's what I want us to understand about the grace of compassion, about the characteristic of God that is compassionate. And this is the aspect that God is the one who sees. God is the one who sees. See, you and I, we're not invisible to God. We're not unnoticed by God. Our doubts, our insecurities, our sufferings, the painful things that we have endured and gone through are not unknown to God. He sees where we are. He has a deep awareness of all the things that we're going through, all the temptations, all the trials, all the frailties, all the times that we've messed up. He sees all of it. He has a deep awareness of the things that we carry with us. He sees us. We don't go unnoticed. We're not invisible. Listen to the way the writer of Hebrews writes and describes Jesus in Hebrews chapter 4. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." See, friends, the story of God, the testimony of who God is that he is compassionate, that he's the one who sees, a deep awareness of the frailties, of the sufferings, of the difficulties of your story and of mine. You and I, we're not unnoticed. We're not invisible. God has a deep awareness. For anyone who has faith in Jesus, for anyone who has trusted him as their Lord, their Savior, their King, well, we are recipients of God's great compassion. We are the recipients of God's great compassion because he sees us. Most of us, if not all of us, live with this fear of obscurity, of being unnoticed. We can be in a crowded room like you are right now, and you can sit there thinking that no one really knows you. No one really sees you. No one really understands the stuff that you have gone through, the sufferings, your doubts, your insecurities, all these things. We can be in a real crowded room like this, but the fear of obscurity draws our attention to the fact that no one really notices. No one really understands. No one really sees. And there's a false narrative that's perpetuated that God is this angry judge sitting up on this throne room someplace, and his disposition towards us is anger. He's disappointed with us. This false narrative that just kind of paints this picture of God as this distant deity. He is unmoved by where we are, and he doesn't even take notice of us. So we wonder at times, does God see us? Is God interested in me? Is he interested in what's going on? Does he even care about my insecurities and my failures and my frailty? But if he does see me, well, then there's all sorts of fear if he were to notice that he would be angry or disappointed or ready to pour forth wrath. But the story of God in the Scriptures is that God deeply sees us. He's deeply aware of our story, and that his primary disposition towards us is compassion. His first description of himself is the Lord is compassionate, slow to get angry, abounding in love and faithfulness. Friends, God is deeply aware of your story. He sees it. You don't go unnoticed to him. And he is moved with compassion for you. Deeply aware. This is what Paul means when he writes to his friends in Rome about God's desire to alleviate the sufferings that we experience. When he writes this in Romans chapter 5. God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. That while we are still stuck in our sinful ways, suffering the ways and the stuff of our life, that Christ died for us. That God had a deep sense and awareness of our suffering, and he came to alleviate and relieve us from the suffering. Christ died for us. While we were still stuck, and He's stuck in our ways of sinfulness, He came to die for us. And in probably the most famous Bible verse in all of history, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Friends, you're not unnoticed. The great story of God is that our sufferings and our frailties and our inadequacies, our doubts, our insecurities, they don't go unnoticed. But God is a God of great compassion. And I know that these verses from Romans and John 3:16, they're familiar to many of us, but perhaps they're so familiar that they've lost their potency. They've lost their power in our life, that we just kind of gloss over them. My prayer for you this morning is that you would just really be aware, that God sees you where you are, and He desires good, and He is moved with compassion for you. And if you have faith in Jesus, then you are the recipient of God's grace of compassion. Compassion. But receiving God's grace of compassion, well, that can be difficult for us. Because if you're anything like me, then we have a tendency to resist. We have a tendency to push against receiving God's mercy or God's grace of compassion. We've talked about this before in other venues, but if you're anything like me, we have this tendency to keep up the appearance of control, that we can manage things on our own, that we can kind of put forth this front to make sure that everyone knows it looks like we're really good. Rather than admitting my need for the compassion and the grace of compassion in my life, I kind of put up this appearance, and I can keep the appearance going for a while. Because to admit my own need for the compassion of God in my life, it takes humility. I have to expose my neediness, at least to God or maybe to another person. And that's risky and it's vulnerable, and I don't really like doing that, so I resist it. I don't want to go there. I'm really happy about talking about your needs for compassion, but it makes me uncomfortable to talk about my needs for God's compassion. It's real easy to point the finger and say, and I can see your need, and it's easy for us to see someone else's need. But if I can keep the emphasis on you and not me, well, then it doesn't expose my vulnerability. I can be real easy the helper instead of the one who needs help. I agree with Glandian, and when he writes this in his book, he says it's often far easier to extend compassion to others than to admit our need for it. It's easier to extend it than to admit our own need for it. But friends, if you and I are going to grow in our relationship with God, then you and I are going to need to admit our own need for God's compassion in our lives, to receive His gift of mercy. And it's going to take risk. It's going to take vulnerability. We're going to have to admit our neediness. But if we're going to grow in the grace of God, we're going to have to take this risky step. And not be so quick to point out the need in someone else's life, but to take a look at ours. I think of the woman in the scriptures who suffered from bleeding for 12 years. She had done just about everything that she can imagine to alleviate her suffering. And she risked embarrassment and ridicule, publicly letting everybody know what she'd been suffering with. But in one instance, she found her way to Jesus. She pushed through the crowds and she got as close to Jesus as she could. She believed that she could just touch the end of His garment, then she would be healed. And when she finally reached through the crowd and she touched the end of His robe, Jesus turned to her. And with compassion in His eyes, He told her, "You're forgiven. You've been healed." But I want you to notice it wasn't just that she touched Him that brought healing. It wasn't just that she got proximity close physically near Him, because lots of people were close to Jesus. Lots of people were touching Him during that day. It was her faith that risked vulnerability and His compassion. It was her faith and her willingness to risk vulnerability and ridicule and public shame and His compassion that brought healing. I mean, think about all the reasons that she might have had to resist compassion. I mean, to admit her need in front of other people, to admit her suffering, to admit her need for compassion in front of others, to admit that she couldn't handle it on her own in front of other people. Maybe that was too much for her. She'd just stay on the side. Risk public shaming and ridicule and people pushing her off to the side. Well, maybe she'd just stay up there. Maybe she'd just take more efforts to manage her issues and her symptoms on her own. She'd been dealing with this for 12 years. And maybe she just kind of learned how to make the best of it. And just to kind of this is what I'm going to deal with for the next 12 years of my life. This is just what it is. If for some reason she came to the place where she couldn't resist it anymore, and the hope for an experience with grace overwhelmed her and overwhelmed all the reasons that she had to resist, and she encountered Jesus. And it made all the difference. So I wonder if there's an area in your life, maybe a struggle that you've been struggling with for maybe 12 years, maybe 2 years, maybe 30 years. You've been struggling with it for it seems like your whole life. And what you need to know more than anything else is that God sees you where you are. That God has a deep awareness of what you are struggling with. God has a deep awareness of your insecurities and your doubts and your failures. And His heart is moved with compassion, a deep awareness of your suffering and a desire to relieve it. But we have to receive it. We have to stop resisting the grace of compassion. Stop making excuses that you can manage it on your own. Take the risky step of vulnerability and admit before the Almighty God Himself that you need the grace of compassion. Perhaps this morning is a morning where you bring your need for God's grace before Him and you just simply ask for a miracle to show up. And as you and I grow in our relationship with God, we grow as recipients of God's compassion, of His grace in our life. It's more than just a one-time thing. It's more than just about forgiveness. But God's grace is for all of life. Power in our life to do for us what we cannot do on our own. And when we grow in our understanding of being recipients of God's compassion, of God's grace of compassion in our life, then it changes how we see things. It changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we see the world around us. It changes how we see other people around us. When we become recipients of God's grace, then it changes our vision. It has to. We begin to see other people through the lens of God's grace and His compassion as well. And we begin to extend the grace of compassion of Jesus to those around us. As men and women apprentice to Jesus, we become channels of grace, where we are extending God's grace to people around us. When the grace of God grips your heart and you realize that you are the recipient of God's outlandish grace, then it changes how you see everything. It changes your perspective. Not only how you see yourself, but how you see others. You extend kindness, patience, mercy, goodness towards other people. You interact with somebody and you remember that they are more than what you see on the surface, that there's a whole story behind them, that they are carrying weights of insecurities and doubts and failures and frailty. You recognize that they have a whole story behind them. They are so much more than what you see on the surface. And it forces you to slow down a little bit, to stop making snap judgments about somebody, to take the time to notice them, to hear them, to see their story, to have a keen awareness of their suffering and a desire to relieve it, to extend the grace of compassion. Leads us to think of the words that Plato once said, to be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Learn to be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. When you become a channel of compassion, of grace, that you turn the focus on people rather than tasks, rather than the things ahead of you. And when you step into that and you extend grace to the people around you, then you will experience the fruit of that, which is a blessing in your own heart as well. That you receive a blessing as well. I've been reading this book for a little while now, and I've been kind of having these ideas in the front of my mind as I've been walking through my days and through the weeks leading up to this morning. And what I found myself in certain times in my life more ready to serve and help other people than I am typically. I was at Chiefs about a week and a half ago, and an elderly woman was there. She was doing her shopping, and she had a small magnifying glass in her hand, and she was trying to read the labels and trying to understand she was going to buy, and she just dropped it, slipped out of her hand, and she was having a hard time to stoop down and pick it up. And I just saw her, and I walked over, wasn't thinking much about it, but I walked over, I just picked it up, and I gave it to her, and I walked on. And she greeted me, and she thanked me real well, and I walked away from there, and I said, "Way to go, Brad guy." Yes. And I thought it was fantastic. And I wish I could tell you that I do that all the time. I wish I could tell you that I walk through Chiefs or I walk through Walmart with just keen awareness of everybody else's stuff around them, and I want to do things for them. But oftentimes I walk through those places and my mind is just preoccupied with my stuff. And I'm too busy on my own things. And I miss an opportunity to extend the grace of compassion to those around them because I'm just too busy with me. Just too busy with me. I'd like to tell you that even since that opportunity, I've looked for more ways. But I found that as quickly as it came, as quickly my own mind got preoccupied again with me. I need to be reminded that not only am I the recipient of God's grace of compassion, but I am called to be a channel of that to those that I meet. The grace of compassion, it's got a language all its own. The language of kindness with deeds of mercy, and to be fully present with someone, to put my phone down, to look at them in the face and to listen to them, to hear their story, to hear what's beyond their words, and to hear with my heart, to listen. See, as followers of Jesus, as recipients of the grace of compassion, we are called to be channels of that, and that changes how we see and interact with others. So what does that mean practically? Well, it might mean that compassion is going to open your heart to needs in our community and needs in our world that seem beyond your ability to meet. They're going to open up your heart to things that just are going to feel like they're so weighty and so large. You hear stories from people in our church community that are volunteering with CASA, court-appointed special advocates, and you'll hear stories of families that are torn apart by the court system, and children, the most vulnerable in our society, and they're being dealt with some real adult issues. And your heart will become heavy about that. Or maybe you'll interact with someone who's going through marital troubles, and it becomes very clear that those marital problems aren't fixed by a one-time conversation. But when you open yourself up to the compassion, you begin to see the things around you, whether it's the vulnerable children or it's marriages or people that are suffering with things that seem so heavy, so large, so way out of your control. It can feel overwhelming. Your hearts can become really heavy on these things. Let me just give you one piece of advice. Don't get overwhelmed. Remember, it's God's job to restore and to bring healing, not yours. It's God's job to restore and protect the most vulnerable in our society. Now, He may use you, but a good place to start is to pray to the God of compassion that not only would He see, but He would intervene and He would sustain them in their sufferings. While you may get overwhelmed and burdened by the various issues around, a good place to start is to pray to the God of compassion that He would see and sustain them. But I also want to warn you. Begin to pray for eyes of compassion like this, and God Himself may move you to be open to the fact that you may very well be the hands and feet of God's compassion to the people He's stirring around your heart. He may be calling you to be the hands and the feet of God's compassion to the people that you are praying for. And you may indeed be called upon by God Himself to demonstrate acts of kindness or mercy, or to listen with a heart that is engaged with compassion, and perhaps even move to act on someone's behalf. Don't resist that. Don't resist it. So let me ask you a question, kind of going back to the questions we had at the very beginning. Where are you going to be this week? Where is there a place or a person or an interaction in your sphere of influence that needs the grace of compassion in their life? They need to be reminded that they're not invisible, that they're not unnoticed. Where is there a person or a sphere of influence, a place, something that's going on in your life this coming week that someone needs to experience the grace of compassion? And where might God be leading you to be a channel of that grace in their life? And what would it look like to demonstrate God's grace to them this week? Let me just invite you to take the 2 courageous steps there. First, think of that person and that situation and just commit to pray for them. That they would experience and know that God sees them where they are, that He has a deep awareness of what they're struggling with. But secondly, would you walk towards them? Maybe make a phone call to them. Some way this week, walk towards them, believing that somehow the Lord wants to use you as a channel of grace and compassion to those around you. To those around you. As recipients of God's grace, you and I are called to be channels of that. And it changes how we see those around us. One of the disciplines we come to on a regular basis is the Lord's table that we'll celebrate in just a moment. The ultimate example of the compassion of God to send Jesus into our messy situation to rescue and redeem and forgive us. We come again this morning humbly reminded that each one of us need Jesus, and we recognize that He sees us where we are, and He has done what it needs to do to rescue us out of our sinful life. And His life and His death, He entered into solidarity with our sufferings. He knows what it's like to experience the sufferings, and then in His glorious resurrection, He lives and He reigns victoriously, conquering death and sin, and inviting us to this eternal life. So this morning, I invite you to come to the table experiencing the compassion, the grace of compassion of Jesus, and then leave this table empowered to extend that same grace to those around you. We come as recipients and empowered to extend it as we go. Practice open communion at Crossroads, which means if you're a follower of Jesus, we invite you to come. In a moment, you'll be dismissed from the backs of your section. There'll be 4 stations up here, and you kind of come on the right-hand side of your section, kind of make a circle around each section. You come forward, you can grab the bread and the cup. You can take the bread and the cup back to your chair with you, and then you can eat the bread and drink the cup at your own leisure whenever you want to take that. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be people on either corner of the worship center. You can come and be prayed for. Maybe there's an area of compassion that you need in your life to experience, or maybe there's someone that you need to extend that compassion to. And you're going to ask today for the courage and the strength to extend that compassion to them. The Apostle Paul tells us to come and examine our hearts as we come to the table. And it's not an examination to see if you're worthy of the table, because this table is a table for sinners. For we're not worthy of it. We're recipients of God's grace in it. But when we examine ourselves, we examine to recognize the sacredness and the seriousness and the grace that God has offered us through Jesus. So I'm going to invite you just to have a moment of silence to reflect on your life and the grace of compassion that Jesus has extended to you, deeply aware of your sufferings and His wish to relieve it that led Him to the cross and ultimately to the resurrection for you. For you. And in a moment, we'll lead you through the responsive reading on the screens as we prepare. If you're serving communion, you can come and get ready at this time. And as I said, in a moment, we'll lead you through the responsive readings.